Mr. Stewart Copeland of the Police fame. Well, he was in other bands too, like Curved Air, and he had numerous side projects after the Police broke up in 1984. But during his time in the Police, though, obviously I became a massive fan. I love Stewart Copeland's drumming. He does very cool things. For back in those days, I'm sure his style has changed a lot. And I know he does a lot more orchestral style stuff nowadays, but I'm mainly going to focus on his output with the Police because, not that I don't care what he does now, but um, his video is more about what made this drummer or that drummer my favorite, and what made him my favorite, one of my favorites, I should say, is obviously his work with the Police, and specifically the Police had this kind of reggae rock thing going on. I guess it was kind of a hybrid. Um, they've always been described as a band that came out of the punk scene, but I never really drew that conclusion. The only thing I can think of is, yeah, they were in London at the time, and that's pretty much where the scene started in England. But they might have had some connections here and there to what was going on, but I never really saw them as a punk band. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Their reggae rock style sound was pretty cool, and when you listen to Stewart's work, the things I notice is like his combination of hi hat and bass at the same time. These like quarter and 16th notes with no snare, nothing else, just a snare. I mean, just a hi hat and a bass drum. He had that kind of a cool thing going on there with that. Also, his snare sound was very unique, or I should say, unique for the time, because he had that really bright, cracking snare sound, whereas a lot of the bands in the early 80s were going to that gated reverb sound on the snare, which I don't, from what I remember, they never did anything like that. He always used that. I think he had a pearl snare and had that really bright sound to it, and I like that really natural, organic sound. There's nothing wrong with studio wizardry, EQing this or whatever, but I prefer an organic drum sound, and he was always really good at bringing that into a song. But anyway, the Police were just a fantastic band, and he was a big part of their success. The drum work he did with them was very, very high level, and I will always enjoy their music even to this day. Well, this one's probably going to be very obvious, but the late great John Bonham. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on him, which is unfortunate. But I mean, what more can you say about this guy that hasn't already been said? Um, since this is just a video on my favorites, not necessarily who this guy is the greatest or this woman is the greatest of all time. You could debate that all year long, and you're never going to have two people that agree with the same thing. But as far as John Bonham goes, what I've always enjoyed about him was, obviously he had power in his playing, and he always seemed to be very relaxed, though. Anytime I've noticed any live recordings, or even in the studio output, it just seems like, yeah, there's this massive drum sound, but it just seemed to kind of big sound, but like it just kind of flowed, you know. So he was just one of those guys that made it sound so effortless, you know. And they had Led Zeppelin had so many different styles of you know, in their music, you know, like country and folk and funk and jazz and hard rock, you know, all these things blended, rhythm and blues, all blended together, and it, you know, just it always worked out really well. Even some of their, I like some of their later stuff that may not even, you know, be. Some people tend to overlook that stuff, but some of that later stuff is really good. You know, I always enjoyed it. But as far as his playing, to me, it seemed like the one thing that really stood out, at least in my opinion, was his footwork, especially like on the bass pedal. But that's what I always enjoyed from it. It seems like he always got nuance and inflection from things like that. But you know, always very fantastic drumming, and uh, it's one of the things that made me a fan of that band. I mean, you know, Jimmy Page is great. John Paul Jones, fantastic bass player. Robert Plant, amazing vocalist. But I would say it was John Bonham that drew me into that band, especially in the late 70s, early 80s, when a lot of that type of music was being played on the FM radio. But anyway, amazing drummer, and he will be one of my all-time favorites, always. Mitch Mitchell. I selected him because I've always been a big fan of Jimi Hendrix and the band he put together with Noel and Mitch Mitchell. Mitch Mitchell was, I guess he could be compared in a lot of ways to Ginger Baker from Cream. I don't have Ginger Baker on my list. That's not because I don't like him. It's because if I added every drummer I liked, this video would be 2 hours long, and you know, I don't want to do that. But it's not that, you know, there will be some drummers I leave off because of that, but that doesn't mean I don't like them. It's just you know, I can't do all of them. So I picked one that was you know, combined a few styles in one, and you could probably say Mitch Mitchell in a way was one of the first rock jazz fusion kind of drummers. I mean, maybe not, you know, it's maybe not 100% accurate, but you kind of get the picture. You know, his style was, you could kind of think of it in a way as like almost like lead drumming, you know, like a lead guitar while lead drumming. You know, just unique syncopations. He did a lot of triplets and things of that nature. But you know, another drummer you might be able to. Well, obviously, I would think he's probably influenced by him. I'm not 100% sure, but it's more than likely would be a drummer like Elvin Jones. But I always I liked his style. You know, a few years later, even a drummer like Keith Moon had that really aggressive lead style, drumming style, which I think is pretty amazing. Yeah, and Keith Moon is another drummer that I really enjoy, but he won't be on this list because, like I said, I could be here for hours talking about all these guys, but I picked the ones that across the board represents what I like the best, why they're my favorite. And, as I mentioned earlier, your the drummer is what takes your band to better places. And I mean, can you imagine the Hendrix experience with a different drummer? That would be interesting, but I think there's a reason why Jimmy picked Mitch, because he knew that he wanted that, I guess, jazzy kind of feel infused into rock music, which worked to perfection. So yeah, amazing drummer, and one of the first that I really started to pay attention to when I listened to music on the radio growing up. So yeah, amazing drummer. Bill Ward of Black Sabbath fame, one of my all-time favorite bands. When we're talking about Bill Ward here, we're talking about a drummer who was very influenced by things like jazz and blues, but you can definitely hear those styles coming through. He definitely did a lot of, kind of like a swing kind of sound in certain songs. Namely, like a song like Fairies Wear Boots. You could hear that bluesy kind of swing music in there. But what Bill Ward is, what I would consider, what he was really good at was he had a knack for tuning his drums. He had a unique way of doing that. And I think I've read before where the influence for that was people like Gene Krupa and Joe Morello. Those jazz greats. But over the years, listening to Sabbath, I was always impressed with his ability to get just the right amount of power in his playing. People don't really think dynamics too much with Black Sabbath, but it was there. Maybe not overly, because a lot of their songs, had these groove elements and whatnot, but there's songs where, there's cross-sticking and, very quiet parts that lead up into, the big sound, which is probably where a band like the Pixies stole it from. That loud, quiet dynamic. Nirvana obviously took that from the Pixies too, but that's always an interesting thing when a drummer can make dynamics are very important, especially in a band that's just guitar, drums, bass, and vocals. You're kind of dealing with a limited palette, so being able to make dynamics work makes the music more interesting. But anyway, always a really big fan of Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin are probably my two favorite bands of all time, and it's mainly because of the drummers. I've always been somewhat of a guitar player. I never claimed to be a good one, but when I listen to music, I always tend to focus on the rhythm and the guitar playing. But you look at a band like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, the drummers, to me, are the secret weapon. You know, Tommy Iommi, yeah, great guitarist, really inventive with his power chords and whatnot. And Jimmy Page was obviously, you know, a wizard, you know, able to coax all those amazing guitar sounds. But it's John Bonham and Bill Ward. Even the bass players, Geezer Butler and John Paul Jones. Um, yeah, I mean, it's the band as a whole that makes the sound, but I've always heard the saying, your band can only go as far as the drummer, and I think that's true to a degree. So, but yeah, Bill Ward, amazing drummer, big fan, and lifelong fan. Danny Carey, um, for this video that I'm doing for my favorite drummers, I tried to get a broad or as broad of a spectrum of drummers as I could, and I guess this would be one from the 1990s. But Danny's probably most well known for his work with the band Tool. But what I enjoy about Danny Carey is he's a very powerful presence on the drum riser. This is a very unique cat because he's got some unusual beliefs and things of that nature. But that's not what this video, I guess, is really about. But I always found him to be interesting from a personality standpoint. But as far as his drum work goes, I've always been a fan of the groove that Tool was able to conjure, and a lot of that has to do with Danny's presence, like I said, on the drum kit. I guess he's probably most well known for polyrhythms. He's pretty big on that, and it gives Tool a pretty unique flavor. I've often heard them described as being mesmerizing, which I guess that's a pretty apt description, but a lot of that comes from the different types of percussion that Danny uses, because you know, he doesn't necessarily just use a standard rock percussion. I mean, I've heard tablas and things like that in his work, but just a very he adds a very nice flavor to their music, and I've always been a big fan, and hopefully you know, Tool or any other band he chooses to work with, he always you know, continues to come up with those unique sounds, which you know, more power to him. Great drummer. Tony Thompson. Why is he one of my favorite drummers? Well, I would say you know, a lot of his work for me was recognizable from the 1970s. Well, he did have some stuff he played on in the 1980s that I was a fan of, but focusing on the 70s first, he played for people like Patti LaBelle, Sister Sledge, and a band called Chic with Nile Rodgers, who's a very famous producer, and Bernard Edwards, who's a really good bass guitarist. But I first became aware of his work with Sister Sledge and Chic. In the 70s, I was a real big fan of that band, Chic, because of songs like Good Times, La Freak, you know, all those songs. From a rock and roll guy's perspective, Yeah, those bands were, I guess, what you could call disco, but maybe disco influence because Nile Rodgers has always said they thought of themselves more as being a rock band. But even taking that into consideration, I still enjoyed the music. I thought the grooves they came up with were pretty good. An interesting story with Tony. Before he joined, Chic with Bernard Edwards and now Rogers, um, he was in another band, and apparently he had a pretty sizable drum kit. Um, when he joined Chic, and when he showed up, I guess for the first time to play with the band, Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards is like, this guy shows up and he's got this huge drum kit, and they're like, "Hey, whoa, what are you doing?" And he was like, "What are you talking about?" They're like, "Tell you what, we're gonna take all this extra stuff away from you. We're only gonna give you a hi hat, a snare, and bass drum." They said, when you can master that, then you can have toms and cymbals and all that stuff back. So Tony said that was a good thing because it taught him how to learn to groove more. Get the most. I guess it was keep it simple, stupid kind of approach, but I guess it made him master more like hi-hat technique and things of that nature. But anyway, all that work those guys did in the 70s was really good. But then going on into the 80s, Tony was asked to join a band called the Power Station, and this band, I guess for a lack of a better word, you could call them a super group, but I guess that could be a little bit debatable. But anyway, using the term super group with members of say Duran Duran or something would probably get a chuckle. But anyway, you got the two guys from Duran Duran, Andy Taylor, the guitar player, and John Taylor, the bass guitar player. Then you got Robert Palmer, who was like a more well known for his like blue-eyed soul / white funk type material, but yeah, obviously he was the lead vocalist, and then you have Tony on the drums. Well, more of the gated reverb approach. That was a band that utilized that quite extensively in their songs, but it did give the drum tracks, I guess, for that time, a lot of power and punch. And but anyway, I was always a fan of Tony's work. Rest in peace, Tony. I know he passed away a few years back, but really good drummer, and always one of my favorites. Frank Beard. Yes, the drummer from ZZ Top. You probably are thinking maybe an unusual selection, but the reason why he's one of my favorites is I spent my formative years growing up in the state of Texas, and obviously ZZ Top is a legendary band in that state. But when I was thinking of different styles of drummers, the first thing that pops into my mind as far as like ZZ Top is like the boogie blues style sound they had. So I wanted to pick a drummer that represented that boogie sound. And ZZ Top does that extremely well. And part of the reason why is Frank Beard. You know, he's definitely got that Texas boogie blues rock sound down to fine art. I've always enjoyed their music, especially you know, probably more the 70s than the 80s, because in the 80s they kind of went in a different direction. Not necessarily a terrible direction, but maybe not what I was really interested in too much. I liked an album like Tres Hombres more than you know, say Afterburner. You know, one of those albums from the 80s. But anyway, I picked Frank because he's really good at that style of drumming, and you know, I just can listen to a guy like that play all day. You know, may not be doing anything like, you know, Neil Peart or something, but you know, sometimes it's not about, you know, all this awesome technique. It's the groove, you know. And I think he exemplifies that. He did a really good job in that band, and I guess that's really all you can ask for in a drummer. You know, instantly when you hear ZZ Top on the radio, you know it's them immediately. So that was my last pick. There's a lot of drummers that are going to be left off, unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, but I just wanted to name just a few off the top of my head that could have made this list but didn't. Not because they're not good enough or, you know, something like that. Don't get the wrong impression. It's just like I said, I didn't want to make this video like, you know, 2 hours long. So guys like Bill Rieflin from Ministry, you know, Revolting Cocks, that infamy. Martin Atkins, same, like he was in Ministry, Public Image Limited. I love his sound. He's got a very post-punk kind of thing going on. Ray Washam, Dale Crover from the Melvins. Just so many great drummers out there, and you know, Terry Bozzio. You know, I love his stuff. Obviously Neil Peart. You know, just a lot of fantastic drummers out there, and unfortunately, I just you know, I'm not going to make it a 2-hour video, so I just picked the ones that represented a more even spectrum of stuff I grew up with and stuff that I've found, you know, to be really, really good and consistent over the years. But anyway, that's it for this video, and you know, drop a like, comment, or anything that you might agree or disagree with. But have a good night.